It was an early November morning in the town of Crosby, Minnesota. Today was a big day. It was the official reopening of the Milford mine, which had been closed since February of that year because of a cave-in and flood. The 12 miners, who would be the first to take the trip down the 200-foot shaft, packed into the elevator cage and began their slow descent into the darkness below. There was an uneasy silence amongst the miners, all nervous to be the first ones to enter the mine. All that could be heard was the hum of the motor lowering the group further down the shaft. One man looked down the shaft toward the bottom and could just make out a white figure in the distance. As they went further down the shaft, more of the men peered down, and all began to see the same thing. At the bottom of the shaft, clinging to the rungs of the wooden ladder, was a pale white figure with a rope attached to its waist. The figure's blank white eyes stared right back at them, as if it were sending them a message. The group's nervousness quickly changed into panic. They scrambled for a way to stop the descent. They looked for any way to halt the elevator and head back toward the surface. Just before they were able to signal for retreat, the blaring sound of the disconnected warning whistle echoed throughout the cavern. The elevator immediately started ascending back toward the lighted surface above. Once there, the 12 miners ran from the entrance, and none of them would enter the Milford mine again. This is one of many stories of the ghost of Clinton Harris, the skip tender who stood guard at the bottom of the mine shaft on the day of its collapse. A day when the Milford mine would fill with mud and water, entombing 41 miners. This is their story. The Cuyuna Range in Minnesota was a key contributor to the iron boom of the early 20th century. Discovered in the 1880s by Keeler Adams while out surveying property lines with his St. Bernard Una. Keeler was having trouble with his compass needle changing direction. He quickly discovered this was due to the vast number of magnetite deposits in the area. It took over 20 years of failure and bankruptcy before any financial backer was successful in mining iron ore. In the early 1900s, one financial developer who was eager to move in on the discovery was George Crosby. Crosby invested heavily in the surrounding land and even developed a town for mining families named after himself. Surrounding Crosby, several mines were developed, including Milford Mine. But what really kicked off the mining boom in Cuyuna was the completion of a rail line, so coal could be brought in and iron ore could be sent out to the Lake Superior docks. As the infrastructure for mining grew, so did the demand for the mineral. The country was growing rapidly, and iron ore played a key part in the expansion of America's great cities. Iron was needed for buildings, bridges, and the ever-expanding railroad. The demand for more iron was being met with a constant development of more mines. Mines and the workers that mined them were in such high demand that they were excluded from the draft in the First World War. Most of the miners who were employed were immigrants, some coming with nothing but the clothes on their back, even more unable to speak any English at all. This created growing communities around the mines and a culture of mining across Minnesota. The mining profession was not one for the faint of heart. It was backbreaking, dirty work, and the level of danger was extreme. Many men would come out of the mines maimed or injured, or some never come out alive. Hundreds of men lost their lives in the mines of Minnesota, the worst of these being the Milford mine, just north of Crosby. The date February 5th, 1924, was a chilly winter day in Crosby. The miners of the Milford mine all made their way to work for the first shift operation. This mine worked 2 10-hour shifts, this leaving a window in between shifts to allow time for blasting further into the depths of the earth. Frank Hervatten Sr. and his 15-year-old son Frank Jr. both worked in the mine. Typically, a 15-year-old was not allowed to work underground in the mine, but the young Frank was a big and strong 15-year-old, and the mine needed all the men it could get. The conversation the father and son had on their way to work this day was a little unique. The elder Frank mentioned to his son that they might have to move on to a different mine in the not-so-distant future. Milford Mine was in very close proximity to Foley Lake, and the safety of the mine was beginning to be questioned by some of the mining engineers. The Crosby family and mine inspectors disagreed with this, but amongst the workers, concern was beginning to spread. The first shift operation that day was just like any other. Frank Jr. was paired with a veteran miner, Harry Hosford, for the day. They were tasked with shoveling the ore into carts to be dumped into the chute and delivered to the surface. It was a difficult task, but the young, strong Frank was just right for it. Later in the afternoon, the younger Frank was called to the surface to grab a tool that was needed in the far depths of the mine by the expert blaster, who just happened to be his father. Frank went down to the depths and delivered the tool, not knowing this would be the final time he would ever see his father alive. The younger Frank returned to his post, scooping the ore to complete his day's work. Just a short distance away from Frank and Harry was another veteran miner, Matt Kangas. He was working all by himself when he felt a strong gust of wind whip against him. The blast was so strong it blew out his mining light and knocked him to the ground. Matt staggered to his feet, a little dazed, and relit his headlamp. Just then, he was hit by another strong gust. Terrified, now knowing exactly what was happening, Matt turned and ran as fast as he could toward the single entrance tunnel out of the mine. As he was running, he stumbled and fell a couple times, but kept pushing until he found the ladder and began pulling himself up. At the same time, the young Frank and Harry had just dumped another load of ore into the chute, when they felt the same gust of air. When Frank felt this, he looked down into a lower level and could see water seeping across the floor. He pointed this out to Harry, who wouldn't believe him, until they felt the second gust. Then they both knew they needed to get out of the mine. By this time, the power in the mine had gone out. The lights were all out except for the glow coming from the miner helmets running toward the shaft. At the base of the shaft, Clinton Harris stood watch over the elevator controls. He was also in charge of the warning whistle. Knowing that it was his responsibility to let all the miners know of danger, Clinton stood by his post pulling on the warning whistle rope. Just then, Matt, Frank Jr., and Harry came running by Clinton and started up the ladder. As they passed Clinton, they begged him to come with them. But knowing there were still so many miners further in the depths, Clinton refused. He tied the warning whistle rope to his waist, continuing to blast the whistle so all could hear. The three miners, Matt, then Frank, then Harry climbed the ladder rungs as fast as they could. The ascent was long, being so deep within the mine. But when they looked back down, they could see the trickle of water was now a rushing wave. As fast as they could climb, the water chased them faster. Matt, at the lead, was beginning to slow. He was tiring and slowing down all three of them. This is when Frank sped up and pushed his head between Matt's legs, pushing him up as fast as he could climb. Just as they were finally nearing the surface, Frank looked behind him, and to his horror, Harry was now waist deep in the water. But the water was full of thick mud from the swampy bottom of Foley Lake and was sucking Harry down into the dark abyss. Frank quickly turned around, and with all the strength he had left, pulled his partner Harry up and out of the muck. The three miners finally made it over the edge of the shaft and collapsed to the ground, completely exhausted. When Frank had finally caught his breath, he rushed back to the mine shaft and peered into the depth. Not 15 feet from the top of the shaft was the bubbling pool of water. Not a single miner would come out of this watery grave, including Frank's father. The young boy would sit at the edge of the shaft for another 3 hours, staring at the water, afraid of going home and admitting the reality to his mother, that his father would never be coming home. The strong wind that all the miners felt that afternoon was the bottom of Foley Lake collapsing into the mine. When this happened, all the air in the mine was forced out the mine shaft, as the rushing water and mud filled every cavity of the mine. The following hours would be frantic for the town of Crosby. The warning whistle that Clinton had manned in the mine was still blasting, continuing to blast for 5 hours, only being silenced when the engineers came out and disconnected it. The townspeople all came to the mine to see what had happened and discover the fates of their loved ones. In all, only 7 of the 48 miners that day made it out safely. 41 miners were now entombed in the flooded mine. There was a decision to make on what would be done with the mine. Would an expensive recovery effort be undertaken so the families could properly bury their loved ones, or would the mine be sealed and left alone as a grave site? The decision was finally made by George Crosby that no expense would be spared to clear the mine and recover all the bodies. Pumping of the mine began immediately, but these efforts were in vain. For every gallon of water pumped from the mine, another gallon from Foley Lake would enter. It was finally decided that both the mine and the lake must be drained. The neighboring mines all lent help with equipment and workers to pump all of the water out. The teams worked around the clock for 12 days until all the water was finally removed. Once the water was gone, the hardest part of the effort was underway. All the mud and muck that filled the mine from the bottom of the lake now had to be removed one shovel at a time. The recovery of bodies was a slow process, almost like an archaeological dig. But after almost 2 months of work, the first 2 bodies were found. The first being that of Clinton Harris, the emergency whistle rope still tied tightly around his waist. By June of that year, they had recovered 16 bodies, all of which were handed off to their loved ones to be given a proper burial. This is also when the body of Frank Sr. was finally found. Frank was found in thick mud pressed against the walls of the cave, clutching the hand of his blast partner, Frederick. Once his father's body was discovered, Frank Jr. moved on and would never enter Milford Mine again. The recovery efforts continued, and by November 4th, the final body was recovered from deep within the mine. The entire recovery project came at a great price, and it was determined that there was plenty of valuable ore still to be mined. So shortly after the last body was removed, the mine was put back into service. Those first 12 miners were sent down to the dark depths, only to come rushing back out, terrified from the whistle warning of Clinton. On the surface, that whistle was never heard. This would continue from time to time in the mine. Miners would be working and hear the warning whistle, only to rush to the surface and find the whistle had never been activated. Milford Mine was officially closed in 1932, part because of the Great Depression, and part because of the lower demand for its iron ore. Mining in the Kiuna region would also begin its decline shortly after, and completely cease in 1967. Today, at the site of the Milford Mine, those 41 miners have not been forgotten. A memorial is now in place, and a boardwalk over Foley Lake has been built to commemorate the names of those lost that February day in 1924.